The Manhattan Project, Architects of Armageddon. The story begins not in a desert testing ground or a secret laboratory, but in the realm of pure theory, in the minds of European physicists haunted by the specter of war. For decades, the atom had been a riddle, a tiny universe of possibility. And in 1938, in Berlin, the riddle was solved. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved nuclear fission. Word spread like a radioactive particle itself, carried across the Atlantic by brilliant refugees like Leo Szilard and Enrico Fermi, men who grasped the apocalyptic potential of the splitting atom. Their fear that Hitler's Germany might harness this power first compelled them to act. The urgency culminated in a letter signed by Albert Einstein delivered to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a formal appeal that birthed the American atomic program and set the stage for a race that would define the century. The vast undertaking, formally organized in 1942 as the Manhattan Engineer District, or simply the Manhattan Project, was a singular act of American will. It was not merely a scientific research effort, but a complete, parallel industrial revolution, operating in total secrecy. Commanding this colossal enterprise was General Leslie Groves, an Army Corps of Engineers veteran whose genius lay not in physics, but in logistics and unyielding efficiency. He oversaw the construction of entire cities in the wilderness. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the staggering industrial complex known as Clinton Engineer Works was born, its sole purpose to enrich the elusive uranium-235, using methods like gaseous diffusion and electromagnetic separation, each a gamble in a game with the highest possible stakes. At Hanford, Washington, the mighty Columbia River provided the cooling necessary for the massive plutonium-producing reactors, converting raw uranium into a second, equally viable path to the ultimate weapon. The brain of the operation, however, lay tucked away on a remote mesa in New Mexico, Los Alamos. This was Project WWII, an improbable intellectual commune led by the charismatic and complex J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist entrusted with designing and building the bomb itself. A convergence of the world's greatest scientific minds, physicists, chemists, metallurgists, and engineers lived and worked under a veil of total military secrecy. Their shared singular goal, the weaponization of the nuclear chain reaction. The scientists wrestled with two distinct designs: the simple gun-type mechanism for the uranium bomb, known as Little Boy, and the fiendishly complex implosion device required for the plutonium core, which would become Fat Man. The latter was a technical and engineering nightmare, requiring perfectly synchronized high-explosive lenses to compress the core to critical density. The moral weight of their work pressed upon them daily, a silent, pervasive anxiety. They were the architects of a power they could barely comprehend, knowing that its only use would be catastrophic. The ultimate moment of truth arrived at dawn on July 16, 1945, on the desolate sands of the Jornada del Muerto in New Mexico. Codenamed Trinity, the implosion device was hoisted atop a steel tower, and the world held its breath. The flash of light was brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a shock wave that rattled windows over 100 miles away, and a mushroom cloud that climbed 40,000 feet into the heavens. The success was absolute, terrifying, and immediate. General Groves telegrammed the news to President Harry Truman, then at the Potsdam Conference, confirming the bomb was ready. The power they had chased for years was now a reality, forcing the final, agonizing decision: how and when to use it. With the war in the Pacific grinding on and American casualties mounting, the new president and his advisors, having briefly debated alternatives, concluded that a demonstration was too risky and an invasion of Japan too costly in human lives. The atomic bomb would be used to force an end to the war. On August 6, 1945, Little Boy fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki. The attacks brought World War II to a swift, shocking conclusion, but also ushered the world across an irreversible threshold. The Manhattan Project achieved its devastating objective, yet its legacy was not merely a victory, but a paradox. The salvation of one war at the cost of igniting the nuclear age and the Cold War standoff that would follow. The men and women who designed this terrible force were left to grapple with their dual role, both saviors and the first architects of Armageddon. The smoke had cleared, both over the Japanese cities and the Jornada del Muerto, but the dust of change had settled everywhere. The successful deployment of the weapons meant the abrupt end of the project's existence as a classified wartime endeavor, forcing the United States to confront the new reality it had unleashed. For the scientists, the moment was one of profound moral reckoning. They had created the bomb to defeat fascism, yet its first use was against an already weakened foe, resulting in indiscriminate mass death. Leo Szilard, who had first urged the effort, now led a chorus of scientists lobbying for international control, a desperate plea to return the genie to the bottle. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant but haunted director of Los Alamos, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, recognizing that he had become death, the destroyer of worlds. The creators were now philosophers and activists, wrestling with a burden that transcended physics. The political and military leadership, however, viewed the achievement through a different lens: power and security. The bomb had guaranteed victory, and its existence was now the ultimate currency of global influence. Control of atomic energy immediately became the central domestic and international policy challenge. In the U.S., fierce debate erupted over whether the technology should remain under military authority or be handed over to civilian control. The resulting McMahon Act of 1946 established the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, signaling a desire for peacetime governance, but crucially, it maintained a strict monopoly on atomic knowledge, cutting off Britain, America's key wartime partner, and creating an almost impenetrable wall of secrecy. Internationally, the American monopoly proved short-lived. The Soviet Union, having been aware of the project through its own intelligence network, saw the bomb as the ultimate threat to its post-war ambitions, initiating its own crash program. Within 4 years, in August 1949, the Soviets successfully detonated their first atomic device, Joe-1, shattering the precarious notion of American invincibility. This moment of seismic geopolitical shift marked the true dawn of the Cold War and the spiraling arms race. The focus shifted from fission to fusion, from the atomic bomb to the far more destructive thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb. Scientists who had worked side by side during the war, like Edward Teller, became evangelists for this next level of escalation, arguing that the Soviet threat demanded ultimate defense. The legacy of the Manhattan Project was woven into the fabric of the modern American state and economy. Gigantic government-funded national laboratories, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and others, became permanent fixtures, centers of scientific research that extended far beyond weapons to energy, medicine, and computation. The culture of absolute secrecy, born of wartime necessity, metastasized into the foundations of the national security state, deeply impacting scientific freedom and public trust. Furthermore, the massive production sites left an environmental legacy of contamination at Hanford and other locations, a lasting, tangible scar on the landscape of the American West that continues to challenge cleanup efforts decades later. The creation of the atomic bomb thus remains the 20th century's most profound demonstration of human ingenuity, but also the most chilling testament to its capacity for self-destruction. The architects of Armageddon did not just build a weapon, they erected the framework for a new, perpetually anxious world, where the shadow of total annihilation hangs even now over the precarious fate of humanity. The great wave of anxiety and technological acceleration that followed the Soviet test in 1949 demanded a new focus for the former architects of Armageddon: survival in the atomic age. The Cold War intensified the pressure on American science, propelling the research community into a cycle of perpetual innovation to maintain a perceived lead. The shift toward developing the hydrogen bomb, fractured the scientific establishment. While figures like Ernest Lawrence and Edward Teller passionately drove the fusion project, others, including Oppenheimer, voiced deep moral objections, fearing that a weapon of unlimited destructive power represented a descent into madness. This descent, ultimately overridden by President Truman's decisive go-ahead in 1950, led directly to Oppenheimer's tragic political persecution and the revocation of his security clearance, a dark chapter illustrating how quickly the state could turn on its own intellectual heroes in the name of security. With the advent of the H-bomb, tested successfully in 1952, the military-industrial complex, a term later coined to describe the permanent fusion of government, industry, and defense, cemented its hold. The technology that began in secret labs now drove the construction of massive delivery systems, intercontinental bombers, ballistic missile silos, and nuclear submarines, creating a global structure of mutually assured destruction, MAD. This doctrine, where the stability of peace rested on the certainty of global annihilation, was the ultimate perverse legacy of the Manhattan Project's success. Yet, the project's impact was not purely martial. The need for vast computing power to calculate chain reactions and blast effects spurred the development of early electronic computers, profoundly accelerating the information age. The infrastructure built for separation and production at Oak Ridge provided the foundation for nuclear energy, promising atoms for peace as a counterpoint to the weapons program. Medical research, using radioactive isotopes generated by the reactor technology, brought revolutionary new diagnostic and therapeutic tools. The scientific and engineering prowess assembled under Groves and Oppenheimer had fundamentally redefined the relationship between fundamental research and massive governmental funding, permanently altering the landscape of American science, making large-scale, goal-oriented research the new paradigm. Ultimately, the documentary's narrative concludes with a look forward from the brink. The Manhattan Project did not merely end World War II, it installed a ticking clock at the heart of global politics. Its story is a microcosm of the 20th century, a journey from high-minded theory to industrial application, from existential fear to catastrophic power, and finally, to a state of sustained, tenuous peace maintained only by the potential for total war. The architects themselves passed on, but their blueprints, the physics, the facilities, and the ethical dilemmas remain, a permanent reminder that the greatest achievements of human intellect carry the heaviest price of responsibility, forcing every generation since to live under the shadow of the Armageddon they set in motion. The true scale of the project's transformation can be measured not just in geopolitical terms, but in the shifts in American culture and self-perception. In the decades following the war, the narrative of the bomb became a deeply embedded, complex mythology. On one hand, it was hailed as a triumph of American ingenuity, the secret weapon that saved countless soldiers' lives and validated a massive investment of national resources. The names of its leaders, particularly Oppenheimer, became synonymous with tragic genius. On the other hand, the vast secrecy and the terrible power unleashed fostered a pervasive sense of dread and vulnerability that found its way into public consciousness. This anxiety fueled an era of pervasive civil defense, epitomized by duck and cover drills in schools and the construction of fallout shelters in suburban backyards. The threat was immediate, invisible, and absolute. Media and Hollywood grappled with the bomb's meaning, cycling through themes of nuclear horror, the mad scientist, and post-apocalyptic survival. The secrecy and power also engendered profound public skepticism toward government and large institutions, particularly after the security witch hunts of the 1950s, the dark side of the national security state that General Groves had helped to forge. For the first time, Americans collectively realized that their continent was not inviolable and that the ultimate threat was one they had created themselves. From the late 1960s onward, historical analysis began to probe deeper than the official narrative, challenging the necessity of dropping the bomb and examining the long-term human and environmental costs. Historians and ethicists scrutinized the interim committee's decision-making process, questioning whether political considerations outweighed military necessity. The accounts of the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, brought the human devastation into sharp focus, serving as a permanent, visceral protest against the calculus of war. This ongoing historical debate ensures that the Manhattan Project remains a living issue, a moral and strategic question mark hanging over the modern world. Today, the original sites, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, exist as national historical parks, monuments to a moment when science, military power, and destiny converged. They are both places of pilgrimage and massive environmental cleanup projects, simultaneously celebrating ingenuity and symbolizing permanent contamination. The legacy is thus one of profound complexity, the foundational science that fuels global energy, the medical techniques that save lives, the computational power that defines the 21st century, all spring from the same root as the thermonuclear threat that defined the Cold War. The story of the Manhattan Project is the story of humanity's unprecedented reach, the ultimate demonstration of its ability to split not just the atom, but the conscience of the world, leaving all of us forever in the shadow of the architects of Armageddon.